On a crisp November morning in 2019, police officers arrived at a seemingly ordinary townhouse in Rexburg, Idaho, a town that had become ground zero for one of the most twisted and tragic cases the United States had ever seen. Inside, they were looking for Joshua Jackson J.J. Vallow, a 7-year-old boy with autism, and his 16-year-old sister Tylee Ryan. The children had not been seen for weeks. Their mother, Lori Vallow, had told everyone, including their grandparents, that they were safe. But as law enforcement knocked, no one answered. The townhouse was abandoned, and what had begun as a missing persons case would quickly spiral into a nightmare. The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. In the months before Tylee and JJ's disappearance, Lori had appeared to those who knew her to be an ordinary woman, a mother, a wife, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But behind the closed doors of her home, an insidious transformation was taking place. Lori, who had once been known as a loving, devoted mother, had become consumed by an obsessive belief in an apocalyptic prophecy, one that would ultimately cost her children their lives. In 2018, Lori met Chad Daybell, a self-published author of Doomsday fiction and a man who had gained a small but devoted following by claiming to have visions of the end times. Their relationship, initially built on shared spiritual beliefs, soon turned into something darker. Chad convinced Lori that they were part of a divine mission, one in which they were destined to lead the 144,000 survivors after the second coming of Christ, but only after eliminating those they deemed dark spirits. According to Chad's vision, many people in their lives were no longer human, but zombies. Their original spirits had been replaced by dark forces. Tylee and JJ were among those who had become these so-called zombies. But it wasn't just their spiritual beliefs that would spiral out of control. As their affair deepened, Lori's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was in the process of divorcing her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, in early 2019. Charles had grown worried about Lori's mental state, about her fixation on Chad's teachings. On January 31st, 2019, he told police that Lori had threatened his life, saying she was a god with a mission to carry out for the 144,000, and if he got in her way, she would kill him. Just months later, Charles was dead. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, shot Charles in the home Lori and Charles had once shared. He claimed it was self-defense, but those who knew Charles, including Kay Woodcock, JJ's biological grandmother, didn't believe Alex's story. They would soon learn that Charles was just the first in a growing list of victims, all sacrificed in the name of Lori and Chad's delusional beliefs. By September 2019, Lori and her children had relocated to Rexburg, Idaho, where Chad lived. There, Tylee and JJ became increasingly isolated. Tylee, once an outgoing teenager with a bright future, was now rarely seen in public. JJ, once an energetic boy with a love for animals, seemed to have vanished from the world altogether. Neighbors who had previously seen them playing outside began to notice the absence. Lori claimed that Tylee was away at college, studying at Brigham Young University, Idaho. But when authorities reached out to the school, they were told that no student by the name of Tylee Ryan was enrolled there. Lori then claimed JJ was staying with a friend. But the claims didn't add up. By late November, Kay Woodcock, who had been trying to contact JJ for weeks, grew frantic. Her request for a welfare check prompted police to arrive at the house. What they found would change everything. When officers arrived at Lori's townhouse in Rexburg, they were met with an eerie silence. The house was empty. The evidence they found pointed to something far darker than a simple case of missing children. Tylee and JJ hadn't just disappeared. They had been murdered. And Lori, with her carefully constructed lies, had left behind a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to her. The investigation began to uncover chilling details. Lori's interactions with Chad Daybell painted a grim picture. But it wasn't until June 2020, when police executed a search warrant on Chad's property in Rexburg, that the truth became undeniable. What they found in the backyard was both horrifying and heartbreaking. Buried in a pet cemetery on the Daybell property, hidden from the world, were the remains of Tylee and JJ. When investigators uncovered Tylee's remains, they found her body dismembered and burned. There was no doubt Tylee had been murdered, but the exact means were obscured by the extent of the damage to her body. JJ's body was found wrapped in plastic and bound with duct tape. He had been asphyxiated. The discovery shocked the investigators. They had known they were searching for missing children, but they had never imagined the grisly truth they would uncover. For the Woodcocks, the pain of knowing that their grandson's life had been stolen was incomprehensible. Kay Woodcock had spent months searching for JJ, calling, texting, and pleading for his safety, only to find that he had been murdered by the woman who was supposed to love him most. In the aftermath of the discovery, the truth began to unravel. Lori and Chad were arrested, first in Hawaii, where they had fled. Lori Vallow was charged with the murder of her children and the conspiracy to murder her former husband, Charles. Chad was arrested on charges related to the concealment of evidence, and eventually, both were charged with murder. But Lori's behavior during the investigation remained unnervingly calm. She refused to cooperate with authorities, continuing to lie about the whereabouts of her children. Throughout the investigation, she remained steadfast in her belief that she was justified in her actions. She maintained that she had been guided by divine visions, that the deaths of Tylee and JJ were part of a higher mission. And despite the overwhelming evidence of her guilt, Lori never wavered in her denials. As Lori's trial loomed, the families of the victims were left to grapple with the emotional devastation of the loss. Colby Ryan, Lori's surviving son from her second marriage, found himself caught between the family he once knew and the monster his mother had become. "It's hard to imagine that this is the same woman who raised me," Colby said. "The same woman who loved me and who I loved." The case reached a final reckoning in 2023, when Lori Vallow was convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of her two children, Tylee and JJ. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her defense, which had centered on her delusions and belief in spiritual warfare, fell on deaf ears in the face of the brutal reality of her actions. The courtroom was filled with grief, outrage, and disbelief. For the Woodcocks, justice was bittersweet. While they had finally gotten the answers they had desperately searched for, the pain of losing their grandson could never be undone. For Colby Ryan, the emotional toll was impossible to articulate. "You can't even begin to understand how much this hurts," he said. "I still can't believe it. I still can't believe she did this." Lori's conviction didn't end the story. It marked the beginning of the final chapter of a tragedy that had been unfolding for years. Chad Daybell's trial, which was set for 2024, would reveal the depth of the depravity that had been the driving force behind this nightmare. The story of Lori Vallow-Daybell was one of manipulation, delusion, and ultimate betrayal. A mother who had once been a loving, devout woman became the architect of her children's destruction. In the wake of their deaths, families were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered existence. The question remained: how did a mother, a person entrusted with the most precious lives, become so consumed by dangerous ideas that she was willing to destroy everything she had built? The investigation into Lori's actions forced the world to look deep into the psychology of a person who had lost all touch with reality. But for those who had loved Tylee and JJ, the final truth was never truly enough. There would be no bringing them back. The pain of their loss would linger forever. Lori's trial marked the end of one chapter, but the story of this tragedy would continue to haunt those who had been left behind, especially the grandparents, who would forever mourn the grandchildren they had lost in the name of a delusion. The search for the truth about Tylee Ryan and Joshua JJ Vallow had already taken an unimaginable turn. But there was still something worse, something darker still hidden behind the blank stares and the empty homes. When the remains of Tylee and JJ were finally discovered in the backyard of Chad Daybell's property, the world understood the reality of the crime. But no one could have prepared for the twisted psychology that had led to these horrific deaths. This wasn't just a case about a mother's betrayal. It was a story of manipulation, control, and the corrosion of everything once sacred, all wrapped in a web of apocalyptic delusions. The unraveling of Lori and Chad's beliefs, the way they consumed everything around them, and how they manipulated others to carry out their will. This would become one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. Before everything crumbled, Lori Vallow was a woman many would have called a doting mother. Raised in a family deeply committed to the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she was once the image of devotion. She was someone who, on the surface, seemed to have it all: a husband, children, and an unshakable faith. But somewhere along the way, everything changed. It began when Lori met Chad Daybell. She was taken by his certainty and charisma. She saw in him someone who had the answers she was looking for. And in Chad's mind, Lori was destined to be his spiritual partner in a grand mission. They began communicating privately, feeding each other's growing sense of divine purpose. Chad told her she was a goddess, part of a divine plan, and that they were meant to lead humanity after the second coming of Christ. Lori became convinced that her children were standing in the way of this mission. The warm motherly instincts that had once defined her began to fade, replaced by an intense belief that her family was an obstacle to her divine purpose. Tylee and JJ had become, in Lori's mind, no longer her children, but zombies. This belief, twisted as it was, provided the justification she needed. It allowed her to see her actions as not just acceptable, but necessary. Killing them was the only way to free their original spirits, to make room for the grand mission she believed she was destined to complete. The turning point came when Lori decided to trust Chad's visions and place her full faith in him, believing that everything she did, no matter how monstrous, was part of a higher plan. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, was a crucial figure in this story. Once a seemingly average man with a troubled history, Alex had slowly been drawn deeper into the world of Chad and Lori's beliefs. As Lori's faith in Chad's visions grew, so did Alex's loyalty to the couple. Alex had been involved in multiple violent incidents throughout his life. He had a history of aggression, a pattern that escalated as he became more entwined with Lori's delusions. In 2019, Alex was directly involved in the killing of Charles Vallow. What was even more troubling was that Alex seemed to have fully accepted the belief system that justified these violent acts. In the eyes of Lori and Chad, Alex had been elevated to a position of spiritual importance. He was seen as someone who would do anything to protect their mission, someone they could manipulate to carry out their will. For Alex, the ultimate act of devotion to his sister and her mission came when he agreed to help carry out the deaths of Tylee and JJ. He didn't just passively stand by. Alex actively participated in the murders, working alongside Lori and Chad to eliminate those who were labeled as dark spirits. His role in these killings was disturbingly matter-of-fact. Once the children were gone, Alex's calmness, his lack of remorse, was chilling. He acted without hesitation. It seemed as though for Alex, his sister's mission had become his own, and he would do anything to support it. Chad Daybell's role was pivotal in shaping Lori's beliefs, but his influence went far beyond just his relationship with her. Together, they had built a dangerous ideology, one that would ultimately consume them both and anyone around them. They believed that the world was divided between those who were light and those who were dark, and that the dark spirits could be cast out, sometimes violently. Chad's teachings became more than just a set of beliefs. They were a justification for murder. The zombie concept was central to this ideology. They had developed a belief system around the idea that a person could lose their original righteous spirit and become a zombie. Once someone was deemed a zombie, it was considered necessary to destroy them in order to release the pure spirit that had once inhabited their body. For Lori, this gave her a twisted sense of purpose. She was no longer just a mother. She was a warrior on a mission to rid the world of darkness and fulfill what she saw as her divine destiny. At one point, Chad gave Tylee a dark rating of 4.1D in an email, a clear marker that she had been deemed a zombie. The same judgment was passed on JJ. Lori believed, with chilling certainty, that they were lost, that she was doing the right thing by eliminating them. The love she had once shown for them had been replaced by a distorted belief that their deaths were necessary for the greater good. The casting sessions the group held were an integral part of this process. They believed that through prayer and ritual, they could cast out the evil spirits from the zombies. But ultimately, they had to go further. The only way to ensure the spirits wouldn't return was through violence. What followed was a series of events that would spiral out of control, culminating in the brutal murders of Tylee and JJ. The details of their deaths remain harrowing, but the central theme is clear. Lori, driven by her faith in Chad's apocalyptic vision, became willing to do anything, including murder, to follow through on the prophecy she had come to believe in so fiercely. Tylee's remains were found dismembered and burned. The method of her killing was so violent, so personal, that it became evident this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but of calculated necessity in the warped minds of Lori and Chad. JJ's body was wrapped in plastic, with duct tape sealing his fate. He was suffocated. The question of why they would do this, would be answered through their twisted belief system. Lori and Chad saw their children not as innocent victims, but as obstacles in their apocalyptic mission. The deaths were not an afterthought. They were part of a calculated plan to bring about what they believed was their divine destiny. The aftermath of their actions left everyone around them grappling for answers. For Kay Woodcock, the discovery of her grandson's remains was a moment of unbearable grief, but also a final clarity. After months of searching for answers, she finally knew the truth. But it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. As the truth about Lori Vallow-Daybell's involvement in the deaths of her children became clear, the emotional toll on the families was overwhelming. Colby Ryan, Lori's surviving son, found himself trapped between the love he had once had for his mother and the horrifying reality of what she had done. His grief was deep, as was his confusion. I had to face the fact that I didn't just lose my sister and brother. I lost my mother too, he said, his voice shaking. I don't know who she was anymore. She was never the woman I thought I knew. This emotional collapse, the loss of a mother, the betrayal of family, the destruction of everything that was once sacred, was felt by all who had once been close to Lori and Chad. The damage they had caused was far-reaching. What had begun as a seemingly private tragedy had now turned into a public horror. As investigators pieced together the last months of Tylee and JJ's lives, they learned the full extent of the psychological manipulation, the emotional abuse, and the outright cruelty of the duo. And yet, for the families, the pain would never fade. The question of how two people could become so consumed by faith, so warped by their own delusions, would be left for the public to ponder. But for those who had loved the children, there was no answer that could undo the grief they now lived with every day. Lori Vallow-Daybell's trial began in April 2023, the moment the world had been waiting for. Throughout the months leading up to the trial, the case had already captured the attention of the nation, as people struggled to comprehend the depths of Lori's actions. How could a mother do this? How could she allow her own children to die, to be discarded like they meant nothing? The question was simple, but the answer was layered with decades of psychological complexity, spiritual manipulation, and the destruction of a family. From the beginning, Lori's defense had been one of denial. She claimed that her children were not dead, but simply missing, and that they were safe. She maintained that she had been the victim of misunderstanding, that she was simply following the instructions of her spiritual beliefs. Her connection to Chad Daybell was central to her defense. In their eyes, they were fulfilling a divine mission, one that was misunderstood by everyone around them. But to those who had been directly affected, the truth was undeniable. The prosecution presented a case that was both meticulous and chilling. The discovery of Tylee and JJ's remains painted a horrifying picture of what had really happened. And the texts, emails, and conversations between Lori and Chad were damning. They had discussed, in sickening detail, their beliefs that the children were no longer their own. To them, the deaths were justified. The tragedy was not the murder of two innocent lives, but the release of these souls from their dark bodies. For the Woodcocks, the emotional toll was unbearable. Kay Woodcock had fought tirelessly to raise her grandson. She had loved him with every ounce of her being. And when he disappeared, the anguish was almost too much to bear. Every day, she hoped for a call, for a sign that JJ was safe. Instead, she was faced with the reality that the child she had helped raise was gone forever. In court, Kay and her husband Larry Woodcock sat quietly, their hearts breaking with every piece of evidence that was laid bare. Colby Ryan was also in attendance, forced to confront the reality of his mother's actions. The psychological toll on Colby was unfathomable. I had to face the truth that not only did I lose my sister and brother, but I lost my mother too, Colby would later say. The very woman who had once been a source of love and support had become a cold and distant figure, capable of unimaginable cruelty. It was the breakdown of trust that hurt the most. Lori had not only murdered her children, but she had destroyed the family in the process. Every person who had ever cared for Tylee and JJ was left in a state of shock, disbelief, and profound grief. No apology, no trial, no punishment could heal the wounds that had been inflicted. As the trial moved forward, the focus turned to the psychological manipulation that had allowed Lori and Chad to justify the deaths. The prosecution delved deeply into the delusional belief system that had been the driving force behind these murders. Their religious ideology had clouded Lori's judgment, making her believe that her actions were divinely sanctioned. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence presented was a text message between Lori and Chad, in which they discussed the zombie concept. Lori had referred to Charles Vallow as a zombie. The same label was applied to Tylee and JJ, with their deaths seen as necessary to free their souls. Lori's deepening conviction in her delusions led to the ultimate act of betrayal. During the trial, former friends like Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastanes testified against Lori, revealing the extent of her manipulation and the coercion she had subjected them to. Gibb, who had once been a close confidant of Lori's, described the dangerous ideology Lori had embraced. Lori believed she was chosen for something bigger, Gibb said. She didn't see herself as a mother anymore. She was on a mission. For those who had been involved in Lori's life before the murders, the transition from a devoted mother to a cold-blooded killer was impossible to grasp. The betrayal of those who loved her was suffocating. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. On May 12, 2023, Lori Vallow-Daybell was found guilty of first-degree murder for the deaths of Tylee and JJ, as well as conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell, Chad's first wife, who had also met a suspicious end. The verdict was a victory for the families who had fought so hard for justice, but it was only a small step toward healing. In July 2023, Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was packed, filled with the faces of those who had suffered. Kay Woodcock stood before the judge, facing the woman who had taken her grandchild's life. "I'll never be able to hug my grandchild again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't understand what you've done to our family." But the pain was not over. Lori's sentencing was only one part of the larger story. Chad Daybell's trial was looming, and for the Woodcocks, for Colby, and for the entire nation, there was still the question of how anyone could become so consumed by delusion, so lost in their own twisted beliefs, that they would kill the ones they loved most. As the trial wrapped up, it was clear that this case would leave a permanent mark on the country's collective consciousness. A family destroyed by faith, shattered by delusion. And the legacy of Tylee and JJ, stolen too soon, would remain, not as a story of death, but as a warning. Colby Ryan, who had once stood by his mother, was now left to rebuild his life from the ashes of the trauma he had endured. "I have to live with the truth every day," Colby said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can never get back the family I lost. My mother is gone and my siblings are gone, and I'm left to carry the weight of that alone." For Kay and Larry Woodcock, the pain was even more profound. "We've been robbed," Kay said in an interview. "We've been robbed of the future we should have had with him. There will never be a day when we don't think of him." Lori's conviction, though a necessary step in seeking justice, could not erase the scars. No sentence would ever be enough to bring Tylee and JJ back.